June 1582, dawn, Cagayan River, northern Luzon. Captain Juan Pablo de Carrión stood on the deck of his war galley as the morning mist lifted from the Kagayan River, revealing the Japanese pirate fleet anchored ahead. 18 large ships, their decks crowded with warriors whose armor gleamed in the early light. Intelligence reports indicated perhaps 600 to 800 Japanese ronin, masterless samurai turned pirates, the most feared swordsmen in Asia. Behind Carrión were 40 Spanish soldiers, a handful of Filipino auxiliaries, and 7 small vessels. By every reasonable calculation, they were outnumbered 15 to 1, facing warriors whose reputation for ferocity and skill exceeded anything the Spanish had encountered in decades of New World conquest. What those Japanese warriors didn't know, what they couldn't have understood despite their centuries of military tradition, was that they were about to face a military technology that would render their legendary swordsmanship and personal courage utterly irrelevant. Within hours, Spanish firearms and tactics would demonstrate that the age of the sword was ending and the age of gunpowder had arrived. This is the story of the Battle of Kagayan, where 40 Spanish soldiers armed with arquebuses defeated 600 samurai, where European military technology met Asian martial tradition, where guns proved definitively superior to blades. It is a battle almost forgotten by history, but one that perfectly illustrated the military revolution transforming warfare worldwide. To understand what happened at Cagayan, we must first understand who the Japanese pirates were and why they had come to the Philippines in the first place. The wokou, Chinese term meaning Japanese pirates, though the crews often included Chinese and Korean members, had terrorized the coasts of China, Korea, and eventually the Philippines for over 2 centuries. But the wokou of the 1580s were different from earlier raiders. These weren't just criminals and outcasts. They were ronin samurai who had lost their masters during Japan's Sengoku Jidai, the warring states period that had consumed Japan in constant civil war for over a century. These ronin were professional warriors, trained from childhood in the arts of war, experts with the katana, masters of battlefield tactics, veterans of countless battles in Japan's brutal civil conflicts. When their daimyo, feudal lords, were defeated, or when wars ended temporarily leaving them unemployed, many ronin turned to piracy as the only trade they knew. By 1582, groups of these ronin had discovered the Philippines, recently colonized by Spain, offered rich opportunities for plunder. Spanish settlements were small and poorly defended. Trade ships carried valuable goods. The local population could be raided for slaves and supplies. The Philippines became a new frontier for wokou operations. The force that arrived at Cagayan River in June 1582, commanded by a ronin whose name Spanish records render as Te Fusa, though the exact identity remains debated, represented one of the largest and best organized wokou expeditions to reach the Philippines. 18 ships, between 600 and 800 warriors, equipped with full samurai armor and weapons. This wasn't a raiding party, but an invasion force. The Japanese warriors wore traditional armor, the yaroi or the lighter dumaru styles, constructed from small iron or leather plates laced together with silk or leather cords. The construction provided excellent protection against cuts and arrows while maintaining flexibility. The distinctive helmet, kabuto, with its flared neck guard and often elaborate decorations, provided head protection while allowing good visibility and hearing. But the centerpiece of samurai warfare was the katana, the curved single-edged sword that represented over 1,000 years of metallurgical development. Japanese swordsmiths had perfected a forging technique that created blades combining hardness with flexibility, capable of holding extremely sharp edges while resisting breaking. A master-crafted katana could cut through bamboo, bone, and even thin metal armor with proper technique. The samurai fighting style emphasized speed, precision, and decisive cuts. Training began in childhood and continued throughout life. A skilled samurai could draw his sword and cut in a single fluid motion, could read an opponent's intentions from posture and breathing, could execute techniques that seemed almost supernatural to untrained observers. These warriors also carried shorter blades, the wakizashi, forming the daishu or paired swords that marked samurai status. Many carried yari, spears with small but extremely sharp blades, effective for thrusting attacks and superior reach. Some carried yumi, traditional Japanese bows, powerful weapons requiring years to master. By 1582, some samurai had access to tanagashima, Japanese matchlock firearms introduced by Portuguese traders in 1543. However, firearms in Japan were still relatively rare and expensive, not yet the dominant weapon they would become. Most samurai still relied primarily on traditional weapons. Considering swordsmanship the highest martial art, the Japanese force that anchored in the Cagayan River believed they faced Spanish colonists similar to those they de-raided elsewhere in the Philippines. Small garrisons with limited military capability, more merchants and administrators than soldiers. They anticipated another profitable raid. They had no idea they were about to face Spanish soldiers representing the cutting edge of European military technology. The 40 Spanish soldiers under Captain Juan Pablo de Carrión weren't just armed men in armor. They represented the culmination of over a century of European military innovation, the Spanish tercio system that had made Spain the dominant military power in Europe. Each Spanish soldier carried an arquebus, the matchlock firearm that had revolutionized European warfare. The arquebus was a smoothbore weapon, approximately 4 feet long, firing a lead ball weighing approximately 1 ounce. The effective range was between 50 and 100 yards, though skilled shooters could hit targets at greater distances. The weapon operated through a matchlock mechanism. The soldier carried a slow-burning cord, the match soaked in saltpeter to ensure consistent burning. When the trigger was pulled, a mechanical arm brought the burning match into contact with gunpowder in the flashpan. This ignited the main powder charge in the barrel, propelling the lead ball toward the target. Loading and firing required following precise steps. Pour measured powder charge down the barrel ram wadding to seal the charge, load the lead ball ram. Another wadding to hold the ball in place. Prime the flashpan with fine powder, blow the match to ensure it was burning properly, aim and fire. A well-trained soldier could complete this sequence in under a minute, achieving rates of fire between 1 and 2 shots per minute. This doesn't sound impressive compared to modern firearms, or even compared to skilled archers who could lose 6 to 10 arrows per minute. But the arquebus possessed decisive advantages that made it the dominant weapon of its era. First, stopping power. An arquebus ball traveling at approximately 1,000 feet per second carried tremendous kinetic energy. Armor that stopped arrows or deflected sword cuts couldn't stop arquebus balls. The projectile would penetrate steel plate at close range, punch through chainmail at any range, and create devastating wounds in unarmored flesh. A hit to the torso usually meant death or incapacitation. A hit to a limb often shattered bone. There was no blocking or parrying an arquebus shot. Second, psychological impact. The noise, smoke, and visible devastation of firearms created terror in enemies unfamiliar with them. The distinctive crack of discharge, the cloud of white smoke, the sight of men falling from invisible impacts, all created fear disproportionate to the actual casualties inflicted. Third, ease of training. Creating a skilled archer required years of practice developing strength and technique. Creating a skilled swordsman required lifetime training from childhood. Creating a competent arquebus shooter required weeks or months of training. This made firearms democratic in a way traditional weapons weren't. A peasant with minimal training and an arquebus was more dangerous than a samurai with decades of sword training. The Spanish soldiers also carried secondary weapons. Most had swords, typically rapiers or cut-and-thrust blades, designed for both slashing and thrusting attacks. These were backup weapons for close combat if enemies closed before firearms could stop them. Some soldiers carried daggers or pistols as additional backup arms. But the real Spanish advantage wasn't individual equipment, but tactics and organization. The Spanish had developed combined arms tactics integrating firearms, melee weapons, and defensive formations in ways that maximized firepower while minimizing vulnerability. The standard tactic involved forming ranks, typically 3 to 4 lines deep. The first rank would fire, then move to the rear to reload, while the second rank stepped forward to fire. This rolling volley maintained continuous fire, even with the slow reload times of matchlock weapons. Against enemies advancing in traditional close combat formations, this continuous fire was devastating. The Spanish also understood the importance of defensive positions and field fortifications. Even in temporary positions, Spanish troops would quickly construct basic earthworks, dig ditches, or position obstacles to make enemy approaches more difficult and to provide cover for reloading. Captain Juan Pablo de Carrión and his 40 soldiers represented this military system. They weren't individually superior warriors. Many were common soldiers of unremarkable background, but they were trained in tactics and equipped with weapons that made individual warrior skill largely irrelevant. The initial contact between Spanish and Japanese forces occurred when Spanish scouts reported the Japanese fleet's presence in the Cagayan River. Japanese had established a fortified camp on the riverbank, their ships drawn up in defensive positions, clearly planning to use Cagayan as a base for raiding operations throughout northern Luzon. Governor Gonzalo Ronquillo de Penalosa, commander of Spanish forces in the Philippines, ordered Captain Carrión to investigate and, if possible, drive the pirates away. Carrión was given 7 small vessels, 40 Spanish soldiers, and a handful of Filipino auxiliaries, whose exact number the records don't specify but was probably between 20 and 50 men. Carrión's force departed Manila and sailed north along Luzon's coast, reaching the Cagayan River in mid-June 1582. As they entered the river and saw the Japanese fleet, the disparity in forces became immediately apparent. 18 large ships versus 7 small vessels. 600 to 800 warriors versus fewer than 100 total forces. The Japanese, seeing the small Spanish flotilla approaching, apparently interpreted this as either spectacular arrogance or ignorance. Spanish records, compiled from testimonies after the battle, indicate the Japanese leadership debated whether to immediately attack and destroy the Spanish vessels or to allow them to land and then annihilate them on shore, where samurai prowess with close combat weapons would ensure easy victory. They chose the second option, a decision that would prove catastrophic. The Japanese allowed the Spanish vessels to approach the fortified camp. According to Spanish accounts, Japanese leaders sent messages demanding the Spanish acknowledge Japanese authority over the region and pay tribute. Carrión responded by demanding the Japanese leave immediately or face destruction. The Japanese response, according to Spanish records, likely embellished, but probably capturing the general sentiment, was laughter. The idea that 40 Spanish soldiers would threaten 600 samurai seemed absurd. Japanese commanders apparently interpreted Spanish demands as either madness or negotiating posture before inevitable surrender. On June 18, 1582, the talking stopped and the fighting began. The exact sequence of events becomes difficult to determine from surviving records, as Spanish accounts emphasize Spanish valor and Filipino accounts mention Filipino participation, while Japanese sources are essentially non-existent since few, if any, Japanese survivors returned to Japan to record their perspective. What's clear is that Captain Carrión ordered his force to land on the riverbank and advance toward the Japanese fortified position. The Spanish formed into their standard formation, ranks of arquebusiers with supporting troops, and began their advance. The Japanese, seeing the Spanish advancing, formed their own battle lines and moved to meet them. This was standard samurai warfare, armies approaching each other, individual champions sometimes fighting preliminary duels, then the main forces engaging in close combat where skill and courage determined outcomes. The Japanese warriors advanced in traditional fashion, weapons ready, confident that once they closed distance, their superior numbers and legendary swordsmanship would overwhelm the small Spanish force. Some Japanese likely carried Tanegashima matchlocks and may have fired them, though Spanish accounts don't mention receiving significant firearms fire, suggesting Japanese firearms were few or poorly employed. As the range closed to approximately 100 yards, Carrión gave the order to fire. The first Spanish rank discharged their arquebuses simultaneously, sending 40 lead balls into the advancing Japanese formation. The effect was immediate and shocking. Multiple Japanese warriors fell, struck by balls that punched through their armor as though it were paper. The distinctive crack of 40 arquebuses firing together echoed across the field. White smoke obscured the Spanish position momentarily. Before the smoke cleared, the first rank had stepped back to reload, and the second rank had stepped forward. Another volley crashed out. More Japanese fell. The survivors pressed forward, closing the distance toward the Spanish position, trying to reach close combat range where their swords would be effective. The third rank fired, then the fourth. Then the first rank, having reloaded, was ready to fire again. The rolling volleys continued with mechanical precision. Every few seconds, another 30 to 40 arquebus balls tore into the Japanese formation. The Japanese warriors, trained from childhood to face arrows, swords, and spears, had never experienced anything like this. Arrows could be blocked with shields or armor. Swords and spears required close combat where skill mattered. But these arquebus balls were invisible death striking from beyond normal fighting range, penetrating armor that had protected them in countless battles, killing with no possibility of defense or counterattack. The Japanese charge faltered, then broke. Warriors who had faced death countless times in close combat discovered that courage meant nothing against weapons that killed before you could reach your enemy. The survivors retreated back to their fortified camp, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead on the field. Spanish casualties in this first engagement were reportedly minimal, possibly zero. Spanish accounts naturally emphasize the one-sided nature of the battle, and we should be skeptical of claims of zero casualties. But the basic fact that Spanish losses were negligible, while Japanese losses were significant, is supported by what happened next. Following the first battle's failure, the Japanese withdrew into their fortified camp and refused further direct confrontation. They had learned the lesson countless other Asian warriors would learn in subsequent decades. Spanish firearms made traditional close combat warfare suicidal. Captain Carrión, rather than attempting to storm a fortified position defended by hundreds of warriors, settled into a siege. His strategy was simple: maintain pressure on the Japanese position, prevent them from foraging or obtaining supplies, and use his arquebuses to pick off any Japanese who exposed themselves. The Spanish built their own fortified position opposite the Japanese camp. They dug entrenchments, constructed firing positions, and established a perimeter that, while too small to completely surround the Japanese camp, controlled the approaches to it. For several weeks, the siege continued in a stalemate. The Japanese couldn't attack the Spanish position without facing the devastating volleys that had broken their first assault. The Spanish couldn't storm the Japanese camp without facing close combat against vastly superior numbers. Both sides waited. During this period, sporadic skirmishing occurred. Japanese warriors would attempt sorties to gather water or supplies. Spanish arquebusiers would fire at any targets that appeared. Japanese casualties mounted steadily. Spanish casualties remained minimal, as the Japanese had no effective way to strike back at enemies fighting from prepared positions. The psychological pressure on the Japanese force must have been immense. These were warriors trained to believe that courage, skill, and determination decided battles. They had survived Japan's brutal civil wars, through superior fighting ability. Now they faced an enemy that killed from distance, using weapons that made traditional martial skill irrelevant. The situation had no precedent in their experience. By early July, after approximately 3 weeks of siege, the Japanese situation had become desperate. Supplies were running low. Casualties from both skirmishing and disease were mounting. Escape seemed impossible with Spanish vessels controlling the river approaches. The Japanese leadership faced an untenable situation. They decided on a final desperate assault. On July 4, 1582, the Japanese forces launched a mass assault on the Spanish position. Spanish accounts describe hundreds of warriors attacking simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the Spanish defenses through sheer numbers and ferocity. The Japanese plan was sound in theory. If they could reach the Spanish position before the arquebuses could inflict crippling casualties, their superior numbers and close combat skills would prevail. The key was speed. Cross the killing ground as quickly as possible, accept the casualties from initial volleys, and engage in melee where samurai training would dominate. The assault began with Japanese warriors charging from their fortified camp toward the Spanish position approximately 200 yards away. The Spanish, warned by scouts of the impending attack, were formed in defensive positions with multiple ranks of arquebusiers ready. As the Japanese charged, covering ground rapidly, the Spanish firing sequence began. The first rank fired at maximum effective range, approximately 100 yards. Lead balls tore into the advancing Japanese. Men fell. The survivors continued forward. The second rank fired. More Japanese fell. The range was now 70 yards. The accuracy improved with decreased range, more balls finding targets. The third rank fired. The Japanese were at 50 yards, sprinting, weapons ready, desperate to close the final distance. The fourth rank fired. The first rank reloaded, fired again. At ranges under 50 yards, arquebuses were devastatingly accurate. Almost every shot found a target. The Japanese charge was withering under a continuous storm of lead. Some Japanese warriors reached the Spanish line. Close combat erupted as samurai engaged Spanish soldiers with swords and spears. In these individual combats, the superior Japanese swordsmanship showed its quality. Several Spanish soldiers fell to katana cuts. But the numbers told the story. Perhaps 50 to 100 Japanese had reached the Spanish line out of several hundred who began the charge. The rest were dead, wounded, or had faltered under the continuous fire. Those who reached the Spanish faced not only the soldiers in the front line, but fresh troops behind them. The Japanese who had survived the charge were exhausted from the sprint, psychologically devastated by the slaughter they'd witnessed, and vastly outnumbered at the point of contact, despite their overall numerical superiority. The melee lasted minutes before the surviving Japanese withdrew. Spanish soldiers reloaded and fired into the retreating warriors. The assault had failed with catastrophic losses. Spanish accounts, likely exaggerated, but directionally accurate, claimed Japanese casualties exceeded 200 killed with many more wounded. Spanish casualties were described as approximately 10 killed and several wounded. Even accounting for Spanish exaggeration and the natural bias of after-action reports written by victors, the casualty ratio was clearly heavily in Spanish favor. Following the failed assault, Japanese resistance collapsed. That night, the surviving warriors attempted to escape downriver in their ships. Spanish vessels pursued and engaged them. The details of this river combat are sparse in records, but Spanish accounts claim several Japanese ships were sunk or captured, though many escaped into the open ocean. The Japanese force that had arrived with 600 to 800 warriors departed with perhaps 300 to 400 survivors, leaving behind hundreds of dead and wounded. They never returned to Cagayan. Word of the defeat spread through wokou networks, and Japanese pirate raids on Spanish Philippines decreased significantly in subsequent years. For the Spanish, the victory validated their military methods and encouraged further colonial expansion. Captain Carrión was celebrated as a hero. The battle became an example cited in Spanish military discussions of how properly employed firearms and tactics could defeat vastly superior numbers of enemy warriors. For the broader development of warfare, Cagayan represented one of the clearest demonstrations that the age of the sword was ending and the age of gunpowder had arrived. Similar patterns would repeat across Asia over the following centuries as European firearms technology spread and Asian militaries adapted or perished. The Battle of Kagayan provides an excellent case study in the relative effectiveness of traditional weapons versus early firearms. The samurai katana represented perhaps the pinnacle of sword technology, combining metallurgy, design, and fighting technique refined over centuries. Against unarmored opponents or enemies with inferior weapons, the katana was devastating. But against arquebuses, the katana was essentially useless. A sword only works within reach, approximately 3 to 6 feet, depending on the weapon and technique. An arquebus works at 100 yards. The samurai had to cross 90-plus yards of killing ground before their weapons became relevant. During that crossing, Spanish soldiers could fire 2 to 3 volleys, potentially killing or wounding dozens of attackers before close combat even began. Even when Japanese warriors reached close combat range, their individual superiority with bladed weapons mattered less than the fact that they arrived exhausted, reduced in numbers, and facing fresh troops. The few occasions where samurai engaged Spanish soldiers in one-on-one combat generally favored the Japanese warrior, but such individual combats were rare. Warfare is decided by systems, not individual duels. The armor comparison also favored the Spanish technologically, though not in practical terms at Cagayan, where Spanish soldiers likely wore minimal armor in the tropical heat. Japanese yoroi provided excellent protection against cuts, adequate protection against arrows, but essentially no protection against arquebus balls. Spanish armor, including steel breastplates and helmets, could stop or deflect arquebus balls at longer ranges, though at close range even steel plate was vulnerable. But at Cagayan, the Spanish victory didn't rely on armor superiority. It relied on firepower superiority. The Spanish could kill Japanese warriors faster than Japanese could close distance and engage. Once that dynamic was established, numerical superiority became irrelevant. Cagayan demonstrated several tactical principles that would define warfare for the next 3 centuries until the development of modern firearms made these early tactics obsolete. First, firepower concentrated in defensive positions beats numerical superiority in offensive action. The Spanish understood this and consistently sought to fight from prepared positions where their arquebus's advantages were maximized and vulnerabilities minimized. Second, disciplined volley fire beats individual marksmanship. Spanish soldiers didn't aim carefully at individual targets. They fired in volleys at enemy formations. The goal wasn't precise killing, but maintaining continuous fire that forced enemies to advance through a constant storm of lead. This was firepower as suppression and psychological weapon as much as directed killing. Third, combined arms integration multiplies effectiveness. The Spanish didn't rely solely on arquebuses. They integrated firearms with melee weapons, defensive positions, and tactical flexibility. When Japanese reached close combat, Spanish soldiers had swords and supporting troops ready. Fourth, logistics and supply determine outcomes in extended engagements. The Spanish maintained supply lines to Manila and could sustain operations indefinitely. The Japanese, cut off from supplies, faced increasing desperation over time. These principles seem obvious in retrospect, but were revolutionary in the 16th century. Traditional warfare emphasized individual warrior skill, personal courage, and close combat prowess. The Spanish system replaced this with standardized training, technological advantage, and tactical discipline. It was warfare becoming industrial, even before industrialization. Unfortunately, we have essentially no Japanese accounts of the Battle of Kagayan. Few, if any, survivors returned to Japan to record their experiences. Those who did return apparently didn't publicize their defeat or produce written accounts that survived. This absence of Japanese sources means we reconstructing their perspective from Spanish accounts and general knowledge of Japanese military culture and wokou operations. This limitation must be acknowledged when discussing what the Japanese warriors experienced and thought. What we can reasonably infer is that the Japanese force at Cagayan consisted of experienced warriors familiar with Japanese firearms but unfamiliar with European military tactics. Japan had acquired matchlock technology from Portuguese traders in 1543, nearly 40 years before Cagayan. Japanese swordsmiths had quickly mastered matchlock production, creating tanagashima that matched or exceeded Portuguese quality. However, Japanese firearms use in 1582 was still developing. Firearms in Japan were expensive, primarily used by specialized troops, and integrated into tactics that still emphasized traditional close combat. The idea of entire formations built around firearms, tactics designed to maximize firepower rather than setting up decisive charges. This was foreign to Japanese military thinking. The wokou at Kagayan likely had some firearms, but probably not many, and probably didn't employ them effectively. Their tactical approach remained traditional: close with the enemy, and engage in melee where superior skill and numbers would prevail. This approach had worked throughout their pirate careers against Chinese, Korean, and Filipino opponents who lacked effective firearms or didn't employ them well. Against the Spanish, this approach failed catastrophically. The psychological impact must have been devastating. Warriors who had built their entire identity around martial skill and personal courage discovered those qualities meant nothing against enemies who killed from beyond reach. The shame of defeat, particularly one-sided defeat, would have been profound in samurai culture, where honor and reputation were paramount. Spanish accounts of Cagayan mention Filipino auxiliaries participating in the battle, but provide few details about their exact role or contribution. This is typical of Spanish colonial records that centered Spanish actions and minimized indigenous contributions. What we know is that Spanish colonial forces throughout the Philippines regularly included Filipino warriors as auxiliaries. These men provided local knowledge, additional manpower, and combat capability. Filipino warriors were skilled with traditional weapons, familiar with local terrain and conditions, and often fought alongside Spanish soldiers in colonial campaigns. At Cagayan, Filipino auxiliaries likely performed scouting, supported Spanish fighting positions, engaged in close combat when Japanese reached Spanish lines, and pursued fleeing enemies. Their exact numbers and specific actions are lost to history, but their presence and contribution should be acknowledged. The Battle of Kagayan's outcome resulted from combined Spanish-Filipino military action, not Spanish effort alone. The Spanish provided firearms technology and tactical expertise. The Filipinos provided numbers, local knowledge, and combat support. Together, they defeated a force that outnumbered them many times over. The Battle of Kagayan occurred during a pivotal period in global military history. Firearms were transforming warfare worldwide, but the transformation was uneven. European militaries had largely adopted firearms as primary weapons by the 1580s. Asian militaries were in various stages of adoption, with some like the Ottomans fielding large firearms-equipped armies, while others like Japan were still transitioning from traditional weapons. This created a window of approximately 100 years, from roughly 1550 to 1650, where European firearms technology and tactics provided decisive advantages against opponents who hadn't fully adapted. Spanish conquests in the Americas, Portuguese expansion in Africa and Asia, Dutch and English colonial ventures, all benefited from this technological advantage. But the advantage was temporary. By the mid-1600s, Asian militaries including Japan, China, and various Indian kingdoms had adopted and mastered firearms technology. The military balance shifted toward parity. European colonial expansion slowed or reversed in areas where indigenous forces successfully adopted firearms and developed countervailing tactics. Japan is a particularly interesting case. Following the introduction of firearms in 1543, Japanese adoption was rapid and comprehensive. By the 1570s, only 30 years after introduction, Japanese armies were fielding tens of thousands of arquebusiers. The Battle of Nagashino in 1575 featured over 3,000 firearms in coordinated volley fire, demonstrating that Japanese had mastered not just firearms technology, but firearms tactics. Why then did the wokou at Cagayan in 1582 apparently lack effective firearms or firearms tactics? The answer likely lies in the wokou composition and situation. These were Ronin warriors who had left Japan and operated as pirates. They were cut off from the latest military developments in Japan. They couldn't afford or access large numbers of firearms. Their pirate operations didn't require firearms when fighting lightly armed coastal populations. When they encountered Spanish soldiers representing European military best practices, the wokou discovered their traditional weapons and tactics were obsolete. It was a microcosm of the broader military revolution, traditional warriors meeting modern warfare and being destroyed. The Battle of Kagayan is almost unknown in popular history. It lacks the dramatic narrative of famous battles, wasn't connected to major historical events, and involved relatively small numbers of combatants. Few history books mention it. Most people, even military history enthusiasts, have never heard of it. But Kagayan deserves recognition as one of the clearest demonstrations of the military revolution that firearms created. It was a controlled experiment in weapons effectiveness. Same battlefield, similar tactical situations, different weapons and tactics, dramatically different outcomes. The battle demonstrated that firearms properly employed beat traditional weapons regardless of the skill and courage of the warriors using those traditional weapons. This lesson would be learned repeatedly across Asia, Africa, and the Americas over the following centuries as European colonial powers expanded and indigenous forces discovered traditional warfare was obsolete. The battle also demonstrated that technological advantage could overcome massive numerical inferiority. 40 Spanish soldiers defeated 600 samurai, not through superior courage or skill, but through superior weapons and tactics. This pattern would define colonial warfare for centuries. Finally, the battle demonstrated the importance of combined arms tactics, defensive positions, and disciplined training. Spanish success came not just from having arquebuses, but from knowing how to employ them effectively. The integration of firearms into a tactical system that maximized their strengths and minimized their weaknesses was as important as the weapons themselves. The Battle of Kagayan teaches lessons that transcend its specific historical context. Technology matters in warfare, but only when properly employed. The Japanese had access to firearms technology, but didn't integrate it effectively into their tactical system. The Spanish did integrate firearms into their tactics and reaped decisive advantages. Training and discipline matter. Spanish soldiers weren't individually superior warriors, but they were trained to fight as coordinated units, to maintain fire discipline, to execute tactical maneuvers under stress. This collective competence defeated individual prowess. Adaptation is essential. The Japanese wokou at Kagayan were fighting in 1582 using tactics that had worked for decades. But they faced an enemy employing tactics they hadn't encountered. Their failure to recognize and adapt to the changed circumstances led to disaster. Numbers aren't everything. 600 against 40 should be overwhelming advantage. But concentration of force at the decisive point matters more than overall numbers. The Spanish firepower created a killing zone that Japanese numerical superiority couldn't overcome. The Japanese couldn't bring their full numbers to bear because most were killed or pinned down before reaching close combat range. These lessons apply beyond 16th century warfare. Military forces today still grapple with technology adoption, tactics development, training standardization, and adapting to new threats. The specifics change. Firearms replace swords. Precision weapons replace massed fire. Information dominance replaces physical dominance, but the underlying principles remain. Today, the Cagayan River flows through the same landscape where Spanish soldiers and Japanese samurai fought in 1582. Battlefield, its exact location uncertain, as records don't precisely specify where the fighting occurred, is likely covered by farms, towns, or jungle. No monuments mark the spot. No museums display artifacts from the battle. The event has largely faded from memory. In Spain, the Battle of Kagayan occasionally appears in military histories of the Philippines' colonial period, but rates only brief mentions. In Japan, the battle is essentially unknown, lost among thousands of other conflicts during the turbulent Sengoku period. In the Philippines, the battle receives occasional mention in local histories, but isn't part of mainstream historical consciousness. This obscurity is undeserved. Cagayan deserves recognition alongside famous battles where firepower defeated traditional warfare. It shares significance with Omdurman, where British machine guns destroyed Sudanese warriors with Little Bighorn, where despite the outcome's reversal, the tactical principles of firepower versus close combat were demonstrated with countless colonial battles where European firearms overwhelmed indigenous forces. What makes Kagayan particularly significant is that it involved Japanese warriors, generally regarded as among the most skilled and disciplined fighters in Asian military history, being decisively defeated by a tiny Spanish force. This wasn't European firearms against untrained tribesmen. This was European firearms against professional warriors from a sophisticated military culture. On July 4, 1582, as the surviving Japanese warriors retreated to their ships and prepared to flee the Cagayan River, they left behind hundreds of dead and wounded. The survivors had learned a brutal lesson about the changing nature of warfare. Courage, skill, and tradition meant nothing against enemies who killed from beyond sword reach. Captain Juan Pablo de Carrión and his 40 Spanish soldiers had achieved one of the most lopsided victories in military history. They had proven that firearms and proper tactics could defeat vastly superior numbers of traditionally armed warriors. They had demonstrated the military revolution in microcosm. The Battle of Kagayan marked one small but significant step in the global transformation from traditional warfare to modern warfare. It was part of a broader pattern playing out worldwide as firearms spread and traditional military systems became obsolete. Some cultures adapted quickly and retained military competitiveness. Others clung to traditional methods and paid the price in blood and conquest. The samurai who fought at Cagayan represented the pinnacle of traditional warrior culture, the end product of centuries of martial development and refinement. Their defeat by a handful of Spanish soldiers armed with crude matchlock weapons demonstrated that the age of the warrior was ending and the age of the soldier had arrived. Warfare was becoming democratic in a way it had never been before. A peasant with weeks of firearms training could kill a samurai with decades of sword training. Birth, social status, years of practice, all mattered less than possession of superior weapons and knowledge of how to use them. This democratization of military capability would transform not just warfare, but society itself over the following centuries. The thunder of arquebuses along the Cagayan River has long faded. The warriors who fought there are centuries dead. The weapons they used are museum curiosities. But the lessons remain relevant. Technology matters. Tactics matter. Training matters. Adaptation matters. The specific tools change, but the principles endure. And somewhere along the Cagayan River beneath farms and forests lie the bones of Japanese warriors who learned too late that the world had changed. that the swords they had trained with since childhood could uncompete with weapons that killed from a distance that individual prowess meant. Nothing against collective firepower, that the age of the samurai was ending. They fought with courage and skill against an enemy they didn't understand, using tactics that were obsolete. They died believing in their own invincibility, destroyed by technology they had encountered but never fully appreciated. Their defeat at Kagayan wasn't failure of courage or skill. It was failure to adapt to a military revolution that was transforming warfare worldwide. That failure cost them everything. And their deaths along the Cagayan River in 1582 announced that the future belonged to firearms, to tactics, to technology, and to whoever could adapt fastest to the changing nature of war.